all pre-taped.
Hello, I'm Diane Kresh, Director of Arlington Public Library, and we're here in conversation live from Diane's living room. We're not live, but we are local. And I'm delighted to be here this afternoon with Sandy Horwitt, who is a writer and longtime Arlingtonian. But let's hear from him about how he came to Arlington and what he's been up to. Welcome, Sandy.
Well, Diane, thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. My wife and then one son, we now have two sons, moved from Chicago to Arlington on January 1st, 1975, thinking that we'd be here for a couple of years, and we have never left. And we just fell in love with Arlington, and my wife did not particularly want to return to the long, gray, cold Chicago winters. And so that's kind of how we made our choice. The way we got here, though, was because of my volunteer work in a congressional political campaign in the Chicago suburbs. I was teaching at the University of Illinois. I was an assistant professor, but I wanted to do something more political. And a friend introduced me to the Abner Mikva for Congress campaign. And I started working one afternoon, licking envelopes, the classic way of being involved initially in politics, when there still were envelopes to lick instead of emails and tweets and text messages to send. And that one day or one afternoon a week led to a whole week at a time during the summer. I took a leave of absence from teaching when I got so inspired by what Abner Mikva stood for as a potential public official. And when he won in a very close election, I was invited to be his legislative aide and press secretary on Capitol Hill in Washington. And that's the story of how we really got to Washington and to Arlington, Virginia.
Okay. And how long then did you stay working on Capitol Hill?
I worked as an aide to Congressman Mikva for 5 years, until the day he became a federal judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, often referred to as the second most important court in the country. And that was my stint on Capitol Hill. After that, I became more of a writer and also a consultant to nonprofit groups and to foundations.
Okay, well, that's quite an interesting career. I, for many, many years, worked at the Library of Congress. And I lived on Capitol Hill, and my two boys went to school on Capitol Hill, so I know the area quite well, and have always been interested in talking with people who had some kind of career on Capitol Hill. You learn so much. You also learn some things that are not so great, but it's a real experience, and delighted to have you here this afternoon. So you have written a book, Conversations with Abner Mikva. I'm sorry, I keep wanting to do that differently. And can you tell me a little bit, you worked with him obviously as a congressman, you volunteered in his office, and that got you here, but what was special about knowing and working with him?
Well, Mikva had a reputation for being the gold standard for public integrity, both in Illinois when he served in the Illinois State Legislature, and then in Congress, and then on the bench. He ultimately became the chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, where some of his colleagues were people such as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Antonin Scalia, and other people that are very recognizable. So he had quite a broad and deep career as a public servant, and he was a very inspiring person. One of the people he mentored, and I want to show the back of the book. This is the front of the book, if you can see this, Diane.
Yes, sir, I can.
Called Conversations with Abner Mikva. And the subtitle is Final Reflections, and I want to talk about that for a bit, on Chicago politics, democracy's future, and a life of public service. But my favorite part of the cover is the back. And there is a photograph of President Barack Obama awarding Mikva the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2014. Abner Mikva was a very key mentor for young Barack Obama in Chicago in the late 1990s when Ab Mikva and his wife Zoe moved back from Washington to Chicago in the late 90s. He taught part-time at the University of Chicago Law School, and so did young Barack Obama as a constitutional law professor. And they became fast friends, and Mikva really became a guide, a political guide for Barack Obama, who was then elected to the state Senate in Springfield, Illinois, in the state legislature, where Mikva had served for the better part of 10 years. So Mikva schooled young Barack in the politics of the Illinois legislature and then later in Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
And because of a phone call, Mikva was instrumental in producing an invitation to Barack Obama to speak at the 2004 Democratic National Convention in Boston.
Oh, wow.
Probably was the most important political speech Barack Obama ever gave, and opened him up to a national audience and excited people for his eventual run 4 years later for president. So Mikva had a big influence on a lot of people. One person we're going to be seeing a lot of here in the Washington area very soon, I think, is another person he mentored for years, and that is Merrick Garland, who has been nominated for Attorney General by President Biden.
Right. So going back to Obama with that 2004 speech, isn't that also the speech where he talked about we're not red states and blue states, but we're the United States? Extremely powerful. So was Mikva instrumental in Barack Obama's work as a community organizer in Illinois, in Chicago rather, or was it more the University of Chicago law connection and constitutional law, et cetera?
Yes, you're right. The community organizing stint by the younger Barack Obama in the 1980s came before he and Mikva knew each other. And by the way, that connects to another part of my career, a biography that I wrote, sometimes referred to as the definitive biography of the father of community organizing, Saul Alinsky. I spent the better part of 10 years after I left Capitol Hill working on that biography. And Alinsky's ideas on community organizing had a big influence on young Barack Obama when he came to Chicago and started to learn the political ropes.
Now, you mentioned Merrick Garland. When we were talking before we actually set up this date this afternoon, I believe you also mentioned that Mikva had a relation or a mentor rather with Elena Kagan. Did I get that right? Okay.
Yes, Elena Kagan was a law clerk for Chief Judge Abner Mikva on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And then when Mikva left the court to spend a year as Bill Clinton's White House counsel in 1994, Elena Kagan joined Mikva in the White House and got to develop relationships there, which really eventually led to her being nominated for the Supreme Court. I should add an interesting little story that hasn't been widely printed at all, except in my book, that when Barack Obama called Ab Mikva, his old friend and mentor, and wanted to know about Elena Kagan, whom he was thinking of appointing to the Supreme Court, Ab said, "Oh, she's terrific, but I also hope that you're considering Merrick Garland." And so Ab had two really high caliber people that he had great influences on. And Barack said, "Well, I think the world of Merrick Garland, but I want to know what you think of Elena Kagan in this conversation." And as Ab said later, by the time he got the call from Obama, probably the president's mind had been made up, but he just wanted to double check about what Ab thought about Elena, and Ab thought that she would be terrific.
Yeah, the book is reflections, conversations. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to write it?
Well, Diane, I heard that Ab was not in great health. We became friends after I left the Hill and he went to the bench. We saw each other a couple times a year typically, but I hadn't seen him in a while, and I heard that his health was not too good. And I knew he had wonderful stories to tell, many of which had not seen the light of day. And so I called him in 2013 and I said, would you be interested in having conversations about what you think about the political world then and now, and what the future looks like to you? And he said, absolutely, I'd love to do that. So for the next 3 years, I got very lucky, Diane. For the next 3 years, we had monthly conversations that lasted the better part of a full day. We'd meet early in the morning for breakfast and then continue until into the afternoon. And he was razor sharp, even though physically he was starting to decline. And so I was fortunate to gain his wisdom, his recollection, his funny stories, many of which are in the book, before the end came. And the end, even after 3 years, for me, the end came too soon, because when I thought I was going to see him still another time, he ended up in the hospital in Chicago. And on the 4th of July, 2016, he died. I suppose it's fitting that someone as noted a public servant as Abner Mikva, like a couple of our other former presidents of another time, passed away on the 4th of July.
Yeah, Adams and Jefferson, I believe.
Yes,
exactly. And when Adams went first and said something like, "But Jefferson still lives," and sadly that was not to be. So what kind of, you talked a little bit about a man of integrity, but really what was he like? Was he affable? Was he gruff? Was he easy to get along with?
Well, like a lot of us, we're complicated. We're many, many things. I think he was all of the things that you mentioned. He had strong opinions, but he also was very pragmatic. And so one of the high qualities that he had, political qualities, that we could use so much today, is that he was able to work across the aisle with Republicans, even though he was a very committed liberal Democrat.
Sure.
We're coming up on an anniversary in this country that I think a lot of our even fellow well-educated Arlingtonians may not know about yet. And that is on July 1st, it's going to be the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18. And Ab Mikva, as a member of the House of Representatives, was a key floor leader in the passage of that amendment. And his colleague who worked with him on this was his good Republican friend, Tom Railsback. And it's a small example of the many times that Mikva found common ground with men and women on the other side of the aisle. And today we see so little of that in this very polarized, often contentious political world that we're living in.
Yeah, it's almost hard to imagine. I was one of the beneficiaries of that legislation. I voted at the age of 18 in 1972. My candidate did not win. I think he maybe carried one state or maybe no states. I don't remember, but I remember what a thrill it was to be able to vote and participate in an election. And I've never lost that excitement. Voting day is still one of my favorite days. I volunteered at the polls a bunch of times, and my mother used to do that when I was growing up. So it's still a big deal. So let's talk a little bit about what your friend would think about politics today, and what, if any, advice he would give to a young Barack Obama or somebody who wants to seek elected office because they love the country and they have ideas and they want to perform public service. What do you think he would, what advice would he give?
Well, Diane, let me tell you that one of the only low points of our discussions that Ab Mikva and I had for 3 years, these monthly discussions, was one day when he said to me, and I want to preface this little anecdote by saying that he loved being in Congress, and before that, in the Illinois state legislature. if he had a calling, a real calling in life, it was to be a legislator.
Mhm.
He was a first-rate judge. He had great respect from his conservative judicial colleagues like Scalia, for example, and Ken Starr, who was also on the court at the same time. But his real calling was as a legislator. And one day we were having our monthly discussion, and he said to me, he said, boy, I don't think I would want to be in Congress anymore the way things are now. And he said it with an expression on his face that was so painful. And I couldn't believe that he was saying this, someone who had loved the institution as much as he had. Well, in subsequent conversations, it turned out that low point was passing, was not permanent. Although he's greatly disturbed by the polarization, the acrimonious debates, and how little gets done these days in Congress, at least up to this point. And we're hoping that with the new administration and so forth, that we will have more progress. I think his advice would be that as difficult as things are these days, our track record in this country is to overcome these periods that seem so deep and so hard to solve, problems that are so hard to solve. And it reminded me when he and I talked about that, it reminded me of my favorite Tocqueville quotes about the great privilege of the Americans is not that they are more enlightened than other people, but they have the capacity to correct the mistakes they make from time to time. And I think we're all hopeful, at least many of us are hopeful, that we are going to see a reform period coming up in the next months or year in this country after what we've gone through. Mikvah had his own reform agenda. At the top of the reform agenda was doing something about how much influence money, big money, has on politics. So at the very top of his reform agenda was public financing of election campaigns, especially at the federal level. And that's part of a high priority package that has passed the House of Representatives. It's in the Senate, and that President Biden says he supports. There are a few other pieces to that legislation, H.R. 1 in the House, but public financing of campaigns is a key part of that. And Mikvah would be working very hard right now and encouraging his contemporary counterparts or people who are in Congress now to make that happen. So he was optimistic, and he said to me, look at all the things we've solved: Jim Crow, the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote after all that, the decades of effort, and it seemed so hopeless for so long. Voting rights, which has been somewhat eviscerated, but was such a major accomplishment after given the history in this country. So Mikvah pointed to all of those examples of how we overcame seemingly impossible odds and steep hills, and that is, to him, is really a good, important part of the American story.
Well, it sounds too like he also had an incredible amount of optimism and resilience to keep at it, even though it looks sort of bleak. You have to keep being vigilant and keep trying to do the right thing. You spoke of his legislative career, but he also spent a long time on the bench. So what would he think of today's judiciary and charges of activist judges and, somebody having more picks and the elections becoming more about who's going to be on the court than who's going to legislate and solve problems?
Yes, he was very critical of the Supreme Court, and we're talking now, Mikvah died in 2016, so we're talking about the Supreme Court of the last decade plus. He was especially critical of, and some of the people on the court were people he knew well. The previous chief judge before Roberts, Rehnquist, was someone that he was a law clerk with, Mikvah was a law clerk with at the Supreme Court in the early 1950s. John Roberts was someone he knew casually, As I mentioned, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a colleague on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He was very disappointed in the decisions by the conservative majority of 5 before Trump made a new appointment when it came to political power cases, including voting rights, including Citizens United, which removed almost all limits on campaign funding for funding of campaigns. Perhaps the case that's quasi-political for sure that he was most outraged about was the case that his old friend on the Court of Appeals was the author of, and that's Scalia, and that's the Heller gun case, which ruled that people have an individual right to own a gun. And Mikvah, who knew a lot about this because he was the leading advocate in the House of Representatives for strict gun control, he had a bill to actually ban the manufacture, sale, and importation of all handguns in the 1970s. It's hard to believe now that that was a reasonably good position, a political position to have. We've regressed so much since then. But when Scalia wrote that opinion, Mikvah was furious because he said the whole history in this country of the Second Amendment had nothing to do with the individual right to own and bear arms. The Second Amendment begins with a well-regulated militia necessary for the security of a free state. The right of people to have guns shall not be infringed. It was all tied to the militia. It wasn't about individual self-defense. And in Mikvah's words, Scalia had perpetrated the biggest lie on the judicial landscape that Mikvah could ever recall. So one reform idea, by the way, that Mikvah shares with conservatives, including a very conservative professor at Northwestern University, Stephen Calabresi, who's a co-founder of the Federalist Society, is to move away from lifetime appointments of the Supreme Court and to have fixed terms of probably something like 18 years. And one of the reasons for doing that is that you even out the number of appointees any particular president has. For example, Jimmy Carter had no appointments to the Supreme Court. Ronald Reagan had 3, and so forth. And it really tilts the court in ways that really are not helpful to the idea of how justice is decided. So Mikvah, late in his life, had heard a discussion about this possible reform of fixed 18-year terms. Once you installed it, it would turn out that every president would end up having 2 appointments, which would even the playing field in a way that Mikvah thought was healthy.
I mean, it's very discouraging. I mean, you look at these institutions, I think one of the things that has most troubled me over the last 4 years has been the downgrading of our institutions and our norms and our standards and what is the true and just thing. And I really worry about whether we can pull back from that. I have to say, January 6th was an absolutely frightening day. As somebody who's lived on Capitol Hill and worked around Capitol Hill and been interested in the political process and elections, I found that horrifying, and I'm really worried about coming back from something like that.
Well, Diane, I feel exactly the same way. I've spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and like you, I worked across the street from where you were at the Library of Congress. By the way, as a staffer, the Library of Congress, of course, is indispensable. CRS is our gold standard and remains that way. But I want to throw a little bit of a brighter light on this very dark period we have been living through and still are living through. And that has to do with voter turnout. I spent a lot of time working with young people in particular over the last 25, 30 years on trying to increase voter participation and civic engagement. And I want to mention before we finish our conversation, the part of Mikvah's legacy that he's most proud of, which has to do with young people. But let me just refer to the turnout in voting in this country in this last election.
Right.
So if one might have said, given how bleak things were for so many of our fellow citizens, everybody would have said, oh, the heck with it. I'm not going to pay any attention and would have stayed home. Now, that's not such an unreasonable sort of thought to have, perhaps, but it's not really, to be a little patriotic, the American way.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And that's a positive note for us to wind down on. The voter turnout was remarkable, the participation. I have many, many friends, and we all wrote postcards and we texted messages. And I draw the line at calling people on the phone because I don't like to be called on the phone, but we did everything else. And Latasha Brown with Black Voters Matter, I mean, they got out there, boots on the ground, and really, really got a lot of people into the process who have not participated previously.
Exactly. And
So,
Diane, before we go, I'd like to tell just one story about what Ab Mikva thought was his most important legacy of all the wonderful, important things he did, including helping Barack Obama become the first African-American president, playing a very important role in that process. When Ab and Zoe Mikva went back to Chicago from Washington in 1997, some of us from the congressional days wanted to create something that would honor the public service contributions of both Ab's wife, Zoe, who was a school teacher and worked in nonprofit organizations, and of course, Ab Mikva himself. We thought about maybe setting up an internship program in all three branches of the federal government. Mikva was one of those rare people in public life who served in all three branches of the federal government. But once we had a dinner discussion with the Mikvahs, because this was not intended to be a surprise, they came up with a better idea. And it's turned out to be a really good idea, a terrific idea. And that is to create a nonprofit organization. It's called the Mikvah Challenge. It's now a chapter in Washington, D.C. And I hope soon there will be activity here in Arlington as well. And the purpose of the Mikvah Challenge is to engage young people, especially young people of color in low-income neighborhoods, in cities around the country, in civic and political affairs, which includes, by the time they reach 18 years old, registering and voting when they're first eligible. But it also means working on issues that they really care about, whether it's gun violence, whether it's gentrification, or any other issue that has to do with their education in many cases. The Mikvah Challenge started just over 20 years ago in Chicago. It's now expanded to a number of cities around the country. And one of our best chapters, in addition to Chicago, is the Mikvah Challenge DC chapter.
Oh, that sounds terrific. I mean, that's the exactly the kind of thing that we hope these conversations will get going, putting people in touch with other people doing good and important work. So we will absolutely add the link. I could talk about politics and people who have been movers and shakers. I could do that all afternoon. I must admit, I did not know of Mr. Mikva, and so I'm delighted that you contacted me and told me about your book and expressed willingness to come onto this program. I think his story is certainly on many levels remarkable, but it's terrific that he has a challenge program. It's sort of the gift that keeps on giving, getting people engaged, especially young people and people of color, in a life of public service.
The Mikvah Challenge is all about democracy's next generation.
I think that's terrific. Now more than ever, I think, frankly, there have been a number of calls for, return to civics courses in high schools, et cetera. I think that's fine, but there's nothing like becoming active, and young people are much more active even than people in my generation. They're worried about the climate, they're worried about economic disparity, they're worried about voter suppression, they're worried about people not having a fair chance and a fair wage, and this is a great way to catalyze and build on that energy that they're already bringing. I have two sons who never miss a day when they don't accuse me of basically ruining the planet for everybody, but the important thing is that they're engaged and they care and they participate. And the Mikvah challenge sounds like a great way to get involved. So thank you. Well, Sandy, I've loved this conversation this afternoon, and I look forward to reading the book and to learning more about this remarkable person. And thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much, Diane.
All right, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. Have a great rest of the afternoon.
You too. Take care.
I will. Bye-bye.
Bye.